Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I spoke to Lorna earlier, and what we are seeing is that there are very big changes going on right now in the all of the social factors that are affecting higher education in the US. But we are also seeing other counseling companies peddling fear around this. And I wanted to share with you some of the factors that are affecting college admission that might actually make it less competitive or slightly easier for our typical clients, if that makes sense. So there are three main developments happening right now. First of all, we are experiencing a drop in the number of 18-year-olds in the US, the domestic 18-year-olds. It's called the demographic cliff. And the highest number was achieved this year at the class of 2025. And it's going to be declining by as much as 15% over the next 5 to 10 years. Also, the Supreme Court, our highest court, has overturned a policy called affirmative action, which had to do with exercising preference for underrepresented minorities, racial minorities, which I will explain a little bit more about later. And the third thing is that we've experienced a lot of political upheaval and unrest, and it has particularly been manifested on the Ivy League campuses. And that has affected everything from the quality of leadership at those universities to just the everyday environment. So that's the overview of the three, and I'll go into some more detail. Let me tell you a little bit about this drop in potential college students. So the birth rates and just the age bubble is passing, and we are going to see a decline of 15% or so in US domestic applicants, which means that the colleges will be looking to the international pool to make up any deficits in their enrollment. This is also going to leave, say, lower ranked colleges scrambling to fill their classes a little bit. And students who may have been less competitive at that level in the past will find themselves having an easier time to be admitted. Now, I would say this is going to affect colleges that are ranked lower, than the top, maybe, 30 to 50 and down. So overall, there's going to be about 330,000 fewer students between 2026 and 2030, and then we'll drop again by another 375,000. And that is on a base of about 15 million undergraduates. So it's not an insignificant drop, but it's there. So what do we expect colleges to do? We think that they will expand their traditional student pool. So instead of focusing as much on 18-year-olds, they might look at adult education, having people come back to college. One of the beauties of the US system is that the door is always open to you. I could go back to school now and go to law school and do that at my age. So they will probably look to expand their typical students by looking at some of the older adults. And that is also a possibility that they would expand it with online education and trying to reach broader audiences, broader potential students. So those are two major areas and ways they might address that drop. I just popped some numbers into the chat for the group, and Lorna, we had not discussed this, but understand that before COVID, there were about 370,000 students coming from China. This was in 2019 to the US. We're down to 227,000. So that's a significant drop since COVID. And Indian students are now the largest source of students in the US. They are up to 331,600. So in theory, the numbers should mean that the Chinese, applicant pool is perhaps a little bit less it's a little bit less intensely competitive right now. At the higher ends, of course, for any individual, it's still very competitive, but overall, the statistics might be a little bit more promising. Let's talk about the next point, which is that the Supreme Court has overruled a practice that's been here since the 1960s, and it was called affirmative action. And in an effort to address people who had been traditionally discriminated against, and they were not represented well in the college population, colleges began to consider applicants' race or economic level, like being impoverished or having a first generation student where the parents had not even been to college. To consider that as a primary part of their application and as part of their admission decision. And so what we saw happening is that a student who was an African American male was considered within that applicant pool, and perhaps those overall testing credentials would be lower, than say an Asian American male applicant pool. So lower objective credentials could be lower for students from these underrepresented minorities, and they might be admitted, whereas students with higher credentials, but from a different part of the applicant pool that was overrepresented, would not be admitted. So there was actually a preference going on there. So the Supreme Court has said that we cannot, in admissions, consider race as a single decision factor, but race can be discussed in general as part of the overall applicant's case. We've only had 1 year of students being admitted under this new policy. And honestly, I think admission offices are still trying to find their way through this. What does this really look like? But we are seeing some real differences in the first year of admissions. What has happened? We've had only one class admitted since this ruling, and the information is somewhat limited. But a study was done in Massachusetts, for example, and they did see declines in underrepresented minority enrollment. MIT saw a 14 percentage point drop in Black and Hispanic and Indigenous peoples enrollment, while Asian American enrollment went up 7%. Black students made up only 5% of MIT's freshman class last year compared to 15% the previous year. I suspect that, the news is that similar trends are happening, that some minority enrollment may be softening at the higher level, which obviously the minorities that have not been underrepresented they're perhaps taking up more spots, and that typically is the Asian pool. And again, we're talking mostly about domestic U.S. here, not international, right? Because an international student from China is not an underrepresented minority in the U.S. and has not experienced discrimination. So there's a difference between being an international student and being a domestic one. But we expect that there will be some softening in this underrepresented minority enrollment, and it's just, we're going to have to wait to see what the numbers are over the next couple of years, because it's changing. The third major thing that may be affecting applications to Ivy League schools, and even the desirability of attending some of these schools right now, what is the atmosphere on campus, is what I would call political unrest. We've seen several presidents resign because of this. Harvard, Columbia, this kind of thing is happening. Applications to Harvard and Brown declined 5% last year. Now, other Ivies and MIT rose, but I'll be curious to see what happened this year, especially at a place like Columbia that's been very much in upheaval over political unrest. So the political unrest, if you live in the US, you're aware of this. There are several factors. It is not just conservative versus more socially liberal students. It is also, especially, the the catalyst has been the Israel's war against Hamas. That war has catalyzed some things, and also the fallout from the Trump election and from the extreme demonstrations on campus has been a decline and even a complete reversal on diversity, equity, and inclusion programming. Lorna has asked me to explain that a little bit. I certainly, you may be familiar with it if you live in the US, and it's hard to capture what that is. But in the intent of the diversity, equity, and inclusion movement is to create programs and policies that intentionally include traditionally discriminated against, people who've been traditionally discriminated against, to include them in governance, to include their voice in decision making. And it's everything from faculty hiring to presentations on campus, right? So just to continue with a little bit about that, how this has affected the atmosphere on campus is a concern. And I think it is a question of crisis in leadership at some schools, or lack of a voice of leadership at some schools. And also, how are the students feeling on campus? So it's something to really take into account. And I wonder if some students, out of fear for whether their voice would be heard or they would even be able to speak comfortably, um, they may seek education elsewhere. So we don't know what's going to happen, but we will see what happened to the numbers this year. Let's talk a little bit. I know we're running a little bit later. It's definitely going to be a longer presentation. Just talk a little bit about other trends that are happening right now. A big one is that the Trump administration has created a lot of uncertainty about whether research funding and other federal funding is going to continue to flow to these universities in the same amounts. We've already talked a little bit about how DEI is, that diversity, equity, and inclusion is falling out of favor. Colleges are really having to consider what happens if their funding changes profoundly. An example of this is that Brown has a $46 million deficit right now.
Yeah.
So I wanted to cover just some details about what's happening here. If you can move on to the next slide for me. There are several reasons for the deficits. One is that Trump is using federal funding for programs and research as a pressure point to force colleges to implement certain policies, like making sure that Jewish students aren't being discriminated against as people tolerate and encourage, say, pro-Palestinian voices on campus. That's a good example, okay? There have been significant cuts made or threatened to be made against colleges. And as they have retrenched, colleges are reconsidering things like, well, maybe we should not do a capital improvement project, or we should freeze hiring. So the other thing that's happening is that, and this is not on our slide, is that colleges here have large endowments, and there has been talk of beginning to tax those endowments at a higher rate. So there's a fear that something might happen with that. So colleges are freezing hiring, especially in the graduate area. Like, are we going to fund graduates? Because that's often funded through research. They are just kind of acting preemptively due to the expected cuts in the funding. So where we know colleges are cutting, Columbia, Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins is such a health research institution, and they are losing $800 million. They will probably cut their budget and lay off current employees, not just a hiring freeze. Duke, Harvard, Stanford have hiring freezes right now. Northwestern is cutting any expansion or capital projects. And whereas I've seen some people talking about undergraduate programs as being cut the way that they were during COVID, that's actually not in the news yet. Some of our lower level state, public institutions might be cutting some programs, but right now, top colleges are not saying that they're going to cut undergraduate programs. Okay, so this is a little bit different. We have seen a couple of places increase their tuition. So UPenn and Yale have increased tuition by almost 4%. And history suggests that other top schools will follow this initiative. But the universities are also reaffirming their commitment to fully funding financial aid or even fully funding graduate students. Princeton is stepping in to fully fund graduate students even if research funding has been withdrawn.
Hope, I have a question for you. I think some of the parents, some of the kids ask me, because the DEI is no longer is their preference anymore. Did you think when they write the essay, they talk about the equality, talk about LGBT, it should change the direction?
I think that we will not see immediate changes in the way that the admission offices are staffed and the sympathy and empathy that they have for students who've faced special challenges due to race or poverty or sexual orientation. Perhaps not as much actual preference for that, but I don't think we'll see an immediate change in that over the next couple of years. But I don't think students need to go out of their way to feature that or those aspects of themselves, especially if they don't want to, if they're not comfortable with it. I don't think it'll help them in particular to do that.
You recommended not write about this?
I think only if it's significant and appropriate for their case. And I think that depends on talking to a counselor, right? But I would say even as recently as last year, I was seeing some preference for those students. If you were LGBTQ, you should talk about it because the colleges were actively trying to enroll you. And I think that will diminish a bit this year.
Not going to affect it so quickly.
The effect won't be felt so quickly on that, but I think it's going to, we've got the same people in the offices and they're still very empathetic and sympathetic toward those stories. So we'll have a big clue when we see what essay prompts come out in the first week of August. Okay.
Okay. The number you share, Hope, is undergraduate and graduate, right? Not just undergraduate, the number from China, India, Hope. I think this is the one thing.
Right.
Yeah.
Under the numbers on the slide were.
So is it actually the number you say is 331, 270? So what I tell them, one of the parents say, hey, the DEI is going to affect American Chinese because we're a minority. I tell them that when the DEI was in effect, it really did not help the American Chinese either. So it's not going to be canceled. It's not. Hope you want to explain to them. I don't think the DEI really protected it.
Right. So you have to understand that there is a clear difference between racial minorities that were traditionally discriminated against in this country and minorities that have not been discriminated against in the same way. Okay. So whereas Black Americans, African Americans experienced enslavement due to race in this country, that is a really active trying to DEI and affirmative action were really trying to help change, I don't know how to put it, really to address the inequities that still leaves in our society. Same thing happened with Native Americans. when you look at Hispanics and all Asian Americans, they don't have that history in this country. I'm not saying that they weren't racially discriminated against, but it's a little different. And certainly DEI in general, I think, is prioritizing what they perceive to be kind of traditionally, historically, truly discriminated against in this country, those groups.